Okay, good morning everyone. Where has the time gone? We've got 2 weeks left. We are going to dive in a moment to the final theme of the course, evolving bodies and brains. Before we do, just a little bit of orientation. As a reminder, next class, Tuesday morning, I'll talk more about what's expected for the written report and oral presentation. The materials for both of those you'll be submitting the following Monday night by 11:59 p.m. And then Tuesday, May 6th, we will be here bright and early. As I mentioned, I don't get to pick the exam time. So 7:30 in the morning, we will all be here. I will bring coffee and donuts. So there will be sufficient sugar and caffeine for all of us for the finale. And we will get a chance to see 60 2.5-minute presentations of a very wide range of wacky and adaptive and intelligent autonomous machines. Fair? Okay. All right. So back to evolving bodies and brains. In this final segment, as I mentioned already, we're going to look at at least four different experiments in which the evolutionary algorithm's reach has been broadened. The data structure that encodes aspects of the robot is going to incorporate features of the robot's brain as well as the robot's body. We're a little bit behind where I'd like to be at this point in the course, so we're going to go a little faster. We're going to try and make our way through rigid robots and soft robots today. We'll see how well we do. So as you can see in lecture 21, 22, 23, and 24, we're going to look at evolving bodies and brains for four different classes of robots, starting with the more familiar one that we've been seeing throughout this course, rigid robots that are kinematic trees. They are rigid components where there's usually some sort of central core and then a bunch of other rigid components attached to that and rigid components attached to that and so on. That's the familiar view most of all of us have about what robots are. That's been sort of the dominant paradigm since the beginning of modern robotics at the end of the Second World War. In the last 10 years or so, as a field, we've started to explore soft robots. We are examples of some combination of the two. We've got rigid stuff inside and sort of soft stuff on the outer part. Insects do it the other way around. They've got their soft and squishy parts on the inside and their rigid parts on the outer side. Thanks to, in particular, advances in materials science, where it's now getting easier and easier to make autonomous machines that are made up of rigid and squishy parts. We'll see in lecture 22 why you might want to do so. Next week in lecture 23, we'll dive into differentiable robots. This has been possible for the last 4 or 5 years or so. Still a very, very, very new technology. For those of you that did the differentiable assignments, you're doing differentiable robotics. There's probably 40 or 50 people on the planet that are now capable of doing that, including you all. So you already are at the bleeding edge. And then you've already seen the Xenobots last week. This is, again, a relatively new technology invented here and at Tufts, in which we attempt to create autonomous and safe machines by getting an AI or an evolutionary algorithm to design those machines out of biological rather than inorganic components. And that'll conclude the course. Okay, let's start with rigid robots in lecture 21. This particular material is drawn from a paper that is 31 years old now. So we're going all the way back to the beginning. Carl Sims, a very, very talented computer graphics researcher and programmer, coded up his own physics engine. So I've said several times in this course, physics engines weren't really invented until 2000. 6 years before that, Carl did it all himself. We're going to watch the video of some of Carl Sims's evolved robots in action now. Okay. Here we go. Okay. You're all familiar with physics engines now. This was an incredible achievement 31 years ago and is still a non-trivial thing to achieve on your own. You can guess what the what the fitness function was for many of these. You'll notice that these robots have shadows. You'll notice on the surface of the cubes, there's things that are being reflected here. Carl not only created his own physics engine, but put in his own ray tracing algorithms, shadow generators. This was not just an advancement of the science of robotics, but a work of art in its own right. Clearly a high water mark in the field of robotics, which is still hard to improve upon. Okay, so we saw swimming. Here's moving over flat ground. Obviously, you can see that the evolutionary algorithm has control of the 3D geometry and the body of the robot, as well as the neural network controller inside the robot. You'll notice there's some bilateral symmetry in some of these robots, like this one. The left side of the body looks like the right side of the body. We'll come back to that in a moment. There is a non-trivial genotype to phenotype mapping in these robots. Here's some Bradenburg type behavior. This is phototaxis going towards the light. These robots were evolved, and then he's playing back the most fit robot and moving the light sources to places the robot's never seen it before. Here's something that I've mentioned as an aside before. This is a co-evolutionary algorithm. There are two evolving populations of robots, and the fitness of one robot in one population is how well it can steal the block away from a robot in the other population. You can see some obvious strategies: cover the block and possibly push your opponent away from the block. That opponent's population evolves a counter strategy. Here's a particularly good solution, which quickly spreads to the other population. If you can't beat them, beat up on them. Particularly aggressive strategy. I don't know how good it is. Or you just give up. Okay. I saw several of you smiling during the video, as students always do when they see Carl Sims for the first time. Why? Obvious answer, they're hilarious, but why? Why the smile? They're pretty cool. Agreed. They're kind of familiar, right? You can see aspects of things we see in nature, symmetry, solutions, and also things that are maybe not so familiar, odd ways in which the evolutionary algorithm is evolving the bodies and brains of these autonomous robots to do what they want. Clearly, they're not the most efficient way of doing it. We've said this many times in this course already. Biological evolution and artificial evolution is a satisficer, not an optimizer. A lot of the agents you see here were evolved to swim and crawl and compete over a scarce resource, and they do a pretty good job, but clearly not an optimal way of doing so. Okay. Regardless, when this paper was published in '94, this kind of opened a lot of folks' eyes to the potential of this technology. We could automate or make less and less assumptions about the machine itself. It's possible we as engineers or roboticists don't need to manually devise the physical structure of the robot. Okay, a huge achievement for the time. How is this possible? We're going to look at the hardware behind this project and then the software behind this project. Let's start with the hardware. Hopefully you can see these two screenshots here. This is from the one in the top left. This is from Jurassic Park. And the big supercomputer you see in the background with blinking lights is not CGI. It's not a fake. It's an actual supercomputer, and it's the Connection Machine 5. This was the leading supercomputer back in the early 90s. Here's a better picture of it down here. Why is it called the Connection Machine 5? Well, it's a multi-core machine. They didn't call it back then, but it was made up of 1,024 cores, and every core was attached to 5 other cores. So you can imagine a lattice. You can imagine a lattice of CPUs, each one which has a very high bandwidth connection to another one. So a very parallel machine, a very highly parallelized machine at the time. This machine was clocked out at 131 gigaflops per second at R peak. So let's work our way through this. So R peak is short for the theoretical peak performance of the machine. So if you're able to run a computer program which occupies all 1024 nodes 99.999% of the time, if you can achieve that machine, those 1,024 cores together will be collectively performing 131 billion floating point operations per second. Not bad. It wasn't the best at that time, but it was definitely very close to the top. If you've got a Mac Pro from the last few years, like the one I'm running this on right now, it clocks out about 91 gigaflops per second. Not quite as fast as this machine that took up an entire room. This was the state of the art. The CM5 was produced by a company called Thinking Machines, and at that time, the CEO of Thinking Machines, Danny Hillis, was looking for a whiz-bang piece of software that would really demonstrate the power of this hardware. Danny hired Carl Sims at that time, the computer graphics researcher who'd done some interesting work before, and said, can you write some software that will occupy all 1024 cores and produce something visually stunning to demonstrate the power of this machine, which he did. Carl Sims created an evolutionary algorithm that had a population size of 300 and spread out those 300 simulations across these 1024 cores. I'm not sure why Carl didn't use a population size of 1024. That would have made more sense. I'm not sure. It might have had something to do with the detail of the hardware. So he was running all 300 simulations, some of which we just saw. They were all running in parallel, and he ran 100 generations to produce the agents that you just saw in that video. It took about 3 hours to do one evolutionary run. So maybe, depending on your laptop or the device you're using in this course, not too far from what you're able to do at the moment. Maybe a little bit beyond, but not too far beyond. Okay, that's the hardware. Let's talk about the software. Let's talk about the evolutionary algorithm. We have a population of 300 genotypes. Each of those genotypes is being turned into a virtual robot inside a simulation running on one of those 1,000 cores. I mentioned that the genotype to phenotype mapping in this project is pretty sophisticated. So let's talk about the genotypes first. We've seen many different evolutionary algorithms in this course now, and they all employ different kinds of data structures. Vectors of floats that are used to label the synaptic weights in a neural network, or trees. In this case, we're going to deal with graphs. Let's start with graphs. A graph is a data structure that's made up of a series of nodes, and there are edges between that connect nodes together. The genotypes that we're going to see here, here's 3 genotypes here and their corresponding phenotypes. These genotypes are directed, meaning that all of the edges that connect pairs of nodes together, they have a direction. Things flow in one way and not the other, indicated by the arrows. And finally, these are also nested graphs. We'll get to the nested part in a moment. And they are multi-graphs. In a multi-graph, that means there can be multiple edges that leave one node and arrive at another node. So the genotypes are nested, directed multi-graphs, and we'll see some more details of the genotypes in a moment. These genotypes, when they are traversed, they cause the construction of the phenotypes you see over here, which should look relatively familiar to you. These are rigid robots. They're kinematic trees. There's usually a central part, and rigid parts are connected together with rotational joints in the way that you've seen before. Okay, how do we take this data structure and produce this virtual robot? We're going to perform this mapping in a recursive manner, and we'll see how this happens in a moment. Okay, this is the overview of the GP mapping. Any questions so far? So far, so good? Okay. All right, here we go. Let's have a look at the genotype. Remember that it's a graph made up of nodes and edges. Each node has, inside that node, there is a whole collection of numbers, and these numbers represent instructions. They're part of the blueprint. So inside each and every node, there is a triplet of numbers that represent a body part dimension, length, width, and height. There's an additional there's an additional integer that represents a joint type, hinge, ball and socket, and so on. Some numbers that represent joint limits. How far can the joint flex inward and how much can the joint rotate outwards? We'll come back and talk about recursive limit in a moment. So we've got some numbers that describe body parts and joints. The edges also have a bunch of numbers associated with them. So every individual edge has a whole bunch of numbers. Most of these numbers represent deltas. They represent ways to change the numbers that are encoded inside nodes. Let's start with body part dimensions. So let's say we visit a particular node. We start at a particular node like this one down here. Inside this node, we find a particular length, width, and height. We take that length, width, and height, and we build a virtual rectangle inside the physics engine with that length, width, and height. We then travel outward from that body to another node, and as we travel along that edge, we read off the change in position triplet of numbers, and that tells us where the new part is going to be placed relative to the old part. Remember when we were talking about, a while back, when we were talking about pi bullet and absolute and relative coordinates? Each object has a position, it has a length, width, and height. When we travel along here, the delta in position tells us where to go, and once we get there, it tells us how to change the orientation of the object. So we just built this object down here. There's a second triplet of numbers here that tell us how to change the yaw, pitch, and roll of the object. So the new object that we're about to build can have a different orientation relative to the first object. Yeah? Okay. Also, when we travel along this edge, there is also change in scale. How do we change the length, width, and height of the object? So the new object that we build when we get to this node has a different position, possibly a different orientation, and a different size relative to the object we just built. Yeah? So nodes contain absolute information and edges contain relative information. Everybody see how that works? Okay. That's body parts, but we've got to connect these body parts together. So when we travel across an edge, We're creating a new body part, and we're going to connect that new body part with a single joint to the body part that we just left, right? We're building the child object, and we're going to connect it to the parent object, which by definition is the one that we just left. How do we know what joint to build? That information is found within the node that we arrive at. We've just built the head body part, and inside this node is information about whether to connect the head to the torso with a hinge joint, with a ball and socket joint. When we create that neck, what are the joint limits of that neck, and so on. Okay, so far so good? Okay, so we're kind of walking our way through the genotype to phenotype mapping for this particular genotype. We've just built the body. We've traveled along this edge. We've just built this head. And we've connected the head to the body with a joint using the information inside here. We're now at this node, and there is no more outgoing edges, so we're done. We're finished with this traversal. I mentioned that the genotype to phenotype mapping is recursive. So we were here before, we went along this edge, but we remember when we leave this object, we remember that there were 4 outgoing edges that we haven't visited yet. I won't go into the details of how we do this. If you've taken a computer science class and learned about recursion and stacks, you know how this works. Doesn't really matter for our purposes. We have a way of remembering that we've only followed one of the 5 outgoing edges from here. So when we're done with this piece, there's no outgoing edges, we jump back to our unfinished place, like a bookmark in a book, and we now pick one of these 4 outgoing edges and follow it. It tells us how to take the position and geometry of this object and change it to create a new limb segment. Remember that each of these 4 outgoing edges has different delta information. So you can see we're building 1, 2, 3, 4 objects when we follow these edges. All of these objects are connected by joints with information inside here, but they're built at different positions relative to the torso. Each of these 4 objects has different orientations relative to this, and it's maybe not obvious to see from this picture, but they may also have different geometries relative to this torso. So far, so good? Okay, so we've talked about the head, torso, 2 upper arms, 2 upper legs. How are these remaining 1, 2, 3, 4 objects built? Let's complete this genotype to phenotype mapping. Where in the genotype is the information about how to build these 4 parts?
The limb segment has a connection to itself, so it just copies another limb segment.
Absolutely. So every time we follow one of these links and build, let's say, this upper leg, when we're done upper arm, when we're finished building this upper arm, there is 1 outgoing edge from this node. So we follow it, we arrive back here. As we travel along this edge, it gives us delta information, and we're able to build a new part, and this part contains information about how to connect this part back to its parent part. We're doing this recursively, so with this self edge, we've just arrived back here. There's yet another outgoing edge. Why don't we just keep creating an infinite number of arm segments? That's what would happen in a recursive mapping if we didn't include one additional detail, which is inside all of the nodes, there is one additional integer called the recursive limit. So every time we leave a node, we decrease that recursive limit by 1. So when we arrive here, let's say the value is 2. When we leave here, the value is 1. Let's say the recursive limit here is 1. When we arrive here, we build the upper arm. When we leave here, we decrease that recursive limit from 1 to 0. We leave this node, follow this edge, get back here, do everything that's described in here, which results in the creation of the lower arm. The recursive limit here is now 0. So if the recursive limit is greater than 0, we follow outgoing edges. But the recursive limit inside here is now 0, so we do not follow all outgoing edges. We're done. Question?
How does it know which to build first, like the head versus the end?
How does it know? Good point. I forgot to mention this. There is one particular node in the graph that's denoted as the start node. Start here. So in this cartoon example, it would be start here, build the torso, and then it doesn't actually matter which of these 5 we follow. We could follow any one of them arbitrarily, and it would still result in the construction of the same phenotype. Make sense? Okay. All right, so that's one genotype to phenotype mapping. There's a lot going on here. Well, there's a couple things we haven't talked about here, but we'll come back to them. As you can guess, the genotype here, the number of nodes and the edges and how they're all connected together, remember that in this experiment, Carl was running a population with 300 initially random nested directed multi-graphs. We just saw, we took one of them and turned it into a phenotype. We could then put this phenotype, this robot, inside a physics engine and see how well it does at swimming or walking or competing for the cube, whatever it is, and assign a fitness value to it. We go on to the next graph in the population, evaluate the resulting phenotype, and keep going until we evaluate all 300 virtual robots, exactly like you're doing in your final project. Delete the ones that get low fitness at swimming or walking or competing over the cube, and make randomly modified copies of the surviving genotypes. Randomly modified copy. We take the entire genotype, we make a copy of it, and as we're copying the graph, we introduce some mutations, some random changes. What are those random changes? You can probably guess. Some mutations add a new node, some of them delete a node, some of them add a new edge at random, some of them delete an edge at random. Some mutations reach inside a node and randomly change one or more of these numbers. Yet other mutation operators reach inside, the mutation operator picks one of these edges at random, reaches inside the edge, and randomly fiddles with one or more of these numbers. Those genetic mutations end up having phenotypic effects. Let's imagine one. I just told you, let's imagine that this node has a recursive limit of 1. Let's imagine this robot survived in the population, so this genotype got randomly copied. When it was copied, everything was copied correctly except the recursive limit inside this node. Let's imagine a mutation operator changed the recursive limit in this node from 1 to 2. The only genetic change. If we then take that modified child genotype and translate it into a phenotype, what's the phenotypic effect? What would the phenotype of that new genotype look like? How would it be different?
We have one more segment?
One more segment? Where? We haven't changed much of the genotype, so most of the phenotype is going to be the same. The mutation only affected this node. It hasn't affected this node or this node. So the body is likely to be the same. The body will be the same. The head will be the same. We've made a change in here. So something about the arms and legs is going to change. What is it?
It'll have 3 links.
3 links. This will also have 3 links. This will also have 3 links, and this will also have 3 links because we've increased the recursive limit. We've changed one number inside the genotype, and that's changed more than one thing in the phenotype. Relatively complicated genotype to phenotype mapping. Everybody see that? Alternatively, a mutation could change geometry, positions, orientation, and you saw some of the diversity that we get from that. Okay, let's exercise our growing intuition about this genotype to phenotype map. I want you to pick one of these 12 phenotypes, and I want you to sketch out pen and paper or on your tablet, however you want, a rough sketch of what you think the genotype would look like. You don't need to sketch in all the numbers, but generally speaking, for some of these phenotypes, what do you think the genotype looks like? How many nodes? How are those nodes connected together? I'll give you a minute to sketch a genotype, and then we'll see if we can come up with some collectively. Some are easier than others. Okay, anybody think they have a solution, any of these? Yes.
The third one had a body and then two lines coming out,
Two other nodes?
or one other node, a joint, and then two arrows connecting the body to the joint, and then two more in the joint that are recursively going
Two more?
inwards.
Like that?
One more.
Okay, let's give it a try. So, robot number 3, this looks like probably the starting point. So we're going to construct this particular object, and then we're going to follow one of these two outward edges to create, let's see, what does that look like? A bird, so we'll call it a wing part. So we've just built this, we'll follow one of these edges to build this wing part. We're going to then do some other stuff, but for the sake of argument, let's come back and follow the second edge for a moment, which probably creates the second wing part that you see over here. I would agree there's probably only two nodes in this genotype because there's only two different kinds of parts here. Clearly there's one that's different from all the rest, and then these 6 parts all look similar. Yeah? Okay, so let's try this again. We just built the body. We're going to follow one of these two outwards edges. It doesn't really matter which one. It's going to tell us how to build this part. You suggested adding 2 outward edges. If we have 2 outward edges, that means ultimately we're going to build 2 child parts and attach them to this parent part. That's not the case here. This part has just one child part. So there's most likely only one outgoing edge, which if we follow it allows us to build the second part of the wing, and then we follow it again to build the third part. The recursive limit inside this one is probably 2. 2, 1, 2, 1, build whatever's here, and do not leave again because now the recursive limit is 0. This looks pretty good to me, pretty close. Other solutions for other virtual creatures?
I did 6.
Okay, 6.
It was pretty similar. I had a body node
A body node.
that had a self loop with a recursive limit of 2. And then 2 edges going to a limb
2 edges going to a limb node
with a recursive limit of 0.
with a recursive limit of 0. Exactly. We're just going to build one part and off we go. Okay, let's give it a try. Let's start, doesn't really matter. We could start with any of these 3 pieces. Let's start with this part. Tells us the information in here, tells us how to build this part. There are 2 outgoing edges, which tell us how to build 2 limbs attached to this body part down here. That makes sense. Here's the body part. You gave us a recursive limit of 0, so we're done with this. We're done with this particular node here. We come back, and we see that there is an outgoing edge here that connects to itself. So we build another body part. We've come back here. We reduce the recursive limit just before we leave, and we come back, build another one. If we follow that edge again, we reduce this to 0 and build another body part down here. And at each of these visits to B, we follow the 2 outgoing edges again. Looks good to me. Okay, which of these 12 phenotypes do you think has the simplest genotype? And by simplest genotype, I mean has the fewest nodes and edges. Just because a robot here has lots of parts, has phenotypic complexity, doesn't necessarily mean that it has genotypic complexity.
Maybe 7.
Why 7?
Because you can make it with just one node and then recurse it 7 times.
An RL of 7. Looks good to me, right? Most of these parts look like they have more or less the same length, width, and height, but every time we add a child part, it looks a little smaller. So the delta in length, width, and height that's encoded in the edge probably tells the mapping how to shrink the block by a little bit. Yeah, multiply length, width, and height by 0.9. You can imagine a mutation that changes the deltas to 1.1, and then each new child part would be 10% bigger than the parent part. Okay, non-trivial genotype to phenotype mapping. In the interest of time, there's a couple other labels here that we're not going to bother talking about. Okay, last bit of the genotype to phenotype mapping, which we haven't talked about yet, is the nested nature of the graph. What is a nested graph? As the name implies, a nested graph is a graph in which every node in that graph contains another graph. Here's a picture of a nested graph on the left. So I've hidden some genotypic details from you. I mentioned that inside the nodes, there's a bunch of numbers that represent how to construct the body. It turns out that inside each node, there is also some graphs which dictate how to build a little bit of brain inside the body part described by that node. Okay. Let's take this particular genotype over here, which is made up of 2 nodes. We're going to ignore the dashed one for a moment. We've got a body node here, as we just described, which describes how to build these 2 parts. And we have a limb node over here, which describes how to build these 4 parts. When we are at the body node and we construct the body node, you'll see that there are 3 little nodes inside. We make copies of those nodes and drop it into the phenotype. These little nodes inside represent neurons. So every time we build a body segment, we're going to drop 1, 2, 3 neurons inside this body node and 1, 2, 3 neurons inside this body node. Every time we build one of the 4 fins, we drop these 6 neurons inside. So this particular robot now has a peripheral nervous system, as you do. Your peripheral nervous system is your spinal cord and all the nerve fibers that run throughout your body. You've got a sprinkling of neurons and synapses throughout your body. That's collectively referred to as your peripheral nervous system. This robot has one too. It's got 3 neurons in here, another 3 in here, 6 in total, another 6 in here, 12, 18, 24. There's a total of 30 neurons so far in the peripheral nervous system of this robot. What do you think these thin arrows represent in the graphs that are nested inside the overall graph? For this project, we've now talked about body parts, joints, neurons. What are we missing?
Those are just your synapses.
The synapses, absolutely. So as we construct the body of the robot and as we're dropping copies of neurons inside here, we're also looking at the wiring diagram and we're also dropping synapses. So every time we make a copy of this neuron inside this fin and then this neuron inside this fin, we create a synapse that connects that neuron to that neuron inside that fin. We do the same thing for that pair. We connect the same pair of neurons inside this fin and this fin and this fin. You'll notice that some of these synapses span nodes and are also emanating from this dashed node up here, which we haven't described yet. This is the one remaining part of the genotype. What do you think this part of the genotype encodes? What aspect of the phenotype of this robot does this special dashed node represent?
Is it like a function to describe its movement? Like it has sine and wave.
Okay, yeah, so you'll notice obviously there's some names inside the neurons. You just mentioned sine and wave, so they're names of functions. What are these functions doing? Yes, they alter the behavior of the robot, but kind of indirectly. In the genotype here, these are descriptions about how to build neurons. And inside the description of how to build an individual neuron, there's a name of a function. Why? We're constructing the phenotype. Body parts, joints, neurons, synapses. We've just built the neurons and synapses, but the neurons and synapses themselves need a little bit more information. We're not quite done specifying the phenotype. What's missing from the neurons and synapses? What do they need? Cast your mind back all the way to almost the beginning of the course when we talked about neural networks. Neural networks are made up of neurons and synapses. Those neurons and synapses, what do they need? Idea? No? Okay.
Isn't there like activation function?
The activation function. So the genotype is saying, put a neuron here, and when you do, assign it an activation function of the absolute value. So in this neuron, while the robot is behaving and values are arriving at that neuron from its incoming synapse, like every other neural network on the planet, that neuron performs a weighted sum. It multiplies the incoming values by the weights of those incoming synapses, and it now has a weighted sum, and it pushes that weighted sum through an activation function, like the absolute value, and the resulting value coming from the activation function is the value of that neuron at that time step in the simulation. Some of these might look kind of familiar. So the absolute value, a wave function. So this is something like a sinusoidal pattern. Carl put in a very broad range of activation functions which aren't really used anymore. It's kind of a detail, not so important for us. Okay, back to this special dashed node. It's also encoding some additional neurons and synapses. Where do these additional neurons and synapses go? What are we missing from the phenotype of this robot? It's got almost everything. The robot has almost everything we have: body parts, joints, neurons, synapses, activation functions, a peripheral nervous system. Lots of other higher animals have peripheral nervous systems, but we have something special, or at least much more of something else that most other higher animals don't have. You're using it right now to try and figure out the answer to this question. Your brain, otherwise known as your central nervous system. In us and some other higher animals, there is a particular clustering of a whole bunch of neurons and synapses. This is not a neuroscience class, so we don't have time to go into why this is so useful. Carl built it in. He built this dash node to represent that this node doesn't tell us to build any body part. It just says make one and only one copy of all of the stuff in here and wire it up to the peripheral nervous system. So this set of 3 neurons, I just told you that this robot has 30 neurons in its peripheral nervous system. It has an additional 3 neurons in its central nervous system. These neurons, they don't really have a position inside the robot. Doesn't really matter. Okay. So far, so good? Okay. Okay, so we've got our non-local brain up here and our peripheral nervous system down here. We're still missing a couple of details. You'll notice that these 4 neurons here have sort of odd labels attached to them. These indicate that these four neurons, when they're copied into the body, these ones become sensor neurons and these become motor neurons. Okay, let's start with the motor neurons. We know these are motor neurons because they start with E for effector. Roboticists are terrible at nomenclature. They got lots of synonyms. Actuators, effectors, motors, muscles, they all mean the same thing. E neurons, whatever the value is arriving at that E neuron, it applies a force. If let's say we're considering this neuron, this motor neuron inside this fin, that motor neuron's value is being interpreted as a torque, a rotational force that's applied to the joint that connects the fin to the main body. You'll notice that inside this fin, there are actually two effector neurons. The number next to it represents the degree of freedom that effector neuron controls. When we talked about joints, we talked about degrees of freedom. In your elbow joint or your knee joint, you have 1 rotational degree of freedom. There's only one way in which your elbow can rotate your lower arm relative to your upper arm. In your shoulder, which is a ball and socket joint, there are 3 degrees of freedom. This one, and we don't quite have 3, it's about 2 3/4. You've got this one as well. So you can imagine it's complicated in your shoulder, but in essence, there are muscles that are pulling and pushing in this direction, pulling and pushing in this direction, and pulling and pushing in this direction. When all of those muscle groups are acting in parallel and you combine motion through those 3 degrees of freedom, you get things like this. Yeah? In this particular robot, this fin is attached to this body with a 2 degree of freedom joint. It's not shown here in the genotype, you'll just have to trust me. So it's not quite a ball and socket joint, it's not quite a hinge joint, it's something in between. It's something that does this and does this, which gives this kind of motion. A pretty good thing for a fin to have when you're trying to swim. Okay, so this effector neuron tells that 2 degree of freedom joint how much to go like this. The second effector neuron tells the second degree of freedom how much to do like this. And over the time of the simulation, the different values arriving at these two neurons produces different motions of the fin relative to the torso. Make sense? Okay. All right. We've got inside here two J neurons. These are joint sensors, which, as you can probably guess now, these two joint sensors are sitting on the 2 degrees of freedom, and they're reporting the angle of those 2 degrees of freedom. So in every fin, there are a total of 6 neurons, 2 sensor neurons, 2 motor neurons, and 2 hidden neurons. That's what makes up the peripheral nervous system, and then some additional central nervous system neurons and synapses. Pretty complicated experiment, but hopefully you get the idea. Okay, here's the list of all the activation functions that Carl used. I think it was a little bit of overkill, but seemed to do the trick. Okay, I'm going to skip over this. We kind of just talked about all that. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over how he did crossover, how he combined genetic material from 2 multigraphs. This has since been superseded by the NEAT algorithm. The NEAT algorithm is neat because it efficiently combines genetic material from different graphs. We've already talked about that. Okay, let's end this lecture by talking about the last segment in the video you saw, where we have a co-evolutionary algorithm, meaning that there are 2 or more populations in which the fitness of any individual in any one population is dependent on the fitness of individuals in the other population. Okay, so how does this work? We create 2 populations of random graphs, random genotypes. We pick one genotype at random from one population, one genotype at random from the other population, create the corresponding 2 phenotypes, place phenotype 1 over here, phenotype 2 over here, and they're placed in this weird starting zone, which has this diagonal up here. So you might have seen it in the video, yet another example of perverse instantiation. If your goal is to grab the cube, an easy way to do it is to evolve to be very tall and fall on the cube. So they placed each of the creatures inside the zone based on their height. If the robot was very tall, they placed it at a horizontal position so that the top of the robot was just touching this diagonal boundary line. Yeah. So this additional experimental detail was put in to try and snuff out this particular aspect of perverse instantiation. Okay. Let's imagine we take creature 1, creature 2, we put them in the simulation, we evaluate the simulation for 1,000 time steps, and now we have to assign 2 scalars to each of these 2 phenotypes, how well they did. We need 2 fitness functions, one for creature 1, another one for creature 2. What do you think those fitness functions look like? What would make sense? We'll call them F1 and F2.
To be as close to the cube as possible.
Let's start with 1 over D. Simplest thing, right? So D is distance. It's always going to be positive. So you get a really, really high value if one of your body parts is really, really close to the cube. Okay, it works. That might work. What would that result? If we used these 2 fitness functions for these 2 populations, what would you expect to see evolving?
Just going right up to the cube and just standing next to it.
Standing next to it or reaching out and just touching it. If D is whichever of my body parts is closest to the cube, let's say, you'd get both robots touching the cube. Simplest thing. That's a bit of what we saw in the video, but definitely doesn't explain all of the co-evolutionary behavior we saw evolving in the population.
You need some competition metric.
There's no, in this simple formulation, there's no competition. I don't care what the other creature is doing as long as I'm touching the block. Clearly in that video, there was some additional detail in these fitness functions that was rewarding for competition. It's not just how well I do, it's how badly you do. How do we incorporate this mathematically? I'm creature one. I and my offspring get more and more fitness if I get closer and closer to the block. And
You could just subtract the distance that the other creature is from the block.
sure. Or could do something like this, right? So if the other creature, if creature two is really close to the block, my numerator is going to start to approach 0, and that's bad for me. So from creature one's perspective, it wants to make this very low and this very high, and vice versa. Yeah? There's lots of other ways you could do it. Here's a way that Carl did it. I actually like this. It's a little bit simpler. So we have fitness functions in which my fitness is not just dependent on what I do, but what other competitors from the other population does. If I'm a lion, whether I'm going to eat is based on how fast I can run and how slowly the gazelle runs, and vice versa from the point of view of the gazelle. Okay, I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. We'll end this lecture here. Here are the results from 4 separate evolutionary trials. In each one, we have evolutionary time measured in generations on the horizontal axis. And we have, as always, fitness plotted on the vertical axis here. We're assuming here that higher fitness is better. We have 2 populations, the black population and the gray population. You'll notice that at generation 0, the value for fitness, the 2 values of fitness for individuals in the initial random population, the fitness values are about the same. There's no reason why random individuals from one population would be significantly better or worse in fitness than individuals from the other population. Makes sense. In this particular fitness function that runs between 0 and 2, 1 is clearly, you get about a value of 1 if you behave randomly. You don't approach the cube, neither do you run away from it or have the block stolen away from you at this point. As evolution starts to proceed from this random population, the black offspring tend to start to do a little bit better than the gray offspring. It looks like in this case, the gray individuals then started to produce offspring that had a counter strategy for whatever the strategy was in the black population, until eventually the gray population was doing significantly better. That advantage started to evolutionarily atrophy, and then they recovered, and so on. Same thing when they went back and started with a different set of a different set of random genomes. In this case, for whatever reason, the black robots evolved some strategy that was so good that the offspring in the gray population had about the same fitness as their parents, which was terrible. Whatever they did, they couldn't get anywhere near the cube. This happens sometimes in evolutionary algorithms and also in machine learning in general. This is called the collapse of gradient. Okay, imagine we brought a high schooler to UVM and we dropped them into an advanced calculus class. And we had dropped them into the final exam of the calculus class. They didn't actually attend the course. Let's see how you do, right? There's not much they can do. They're pretty likely to get 0 out of 100 on that exam. If they try something else, they're also likely to get 0 out of 100 on the exam. It's just too difficult. There's nothing that prospective learner can do or evolver can do to find something by trial and error in an evolutionary process that starts to produce better fitness. They've basically moved into a part of the fitness landscape in which they're in a valley, and that valley is flat. It's very low and flat in all directions. They cannot find a hill to start climbing. Yeah? Okay. Any questions about any of that? Okay, apologies for going a little bit quicker today, but I'm trying to play catch up here. We've just finished talking about evolving bodies and brains for rigid robots. We've got 15 minutes left. We'll introduce evolving bodies and brains for soft robots. We've seen a couple of soft robots already. Why build soft robots? It's harder to build robots out of exotic materials that are made up of soft and rigid components. As usual, our good friend the octopus indicates why we might want to build soft robots. Imagine there's a terrible natural disaster, collapse of buildings, rubble. We would like to be able to send an autonomous machine into the rubble to find whether there are any human survivors in that particular piece of wreckage and whether it's worth the risk of sending in a human rescue team to try and liberate the human survivors. Our octopus gets stuck here, the last little bit. What's it having a problem with? Obviously, octopi are soft, but not 100% soft. They've got one hard piece, which is the part that got stuck at the end there.
Just the beak.
It's the beak, right? They still got to eat. And typically they're eating fish and crustaceans, which also have hard parts, right? You need something that's a little bit hard. Okay, so why build soft robots? There's one obvious reason. It's easier for soft robots, in theory, we haven't got there yet, to be able to reach areas that are difficult for other robots and humans to reach. Ultimately, in robotics, we're always interested in the 4 Ds, jobs that are dull, distant, dirty, and/or dull. Okay. A student who took this class many years ago now, Nick Cheney, made use of one of the very first soft robot simulators. We'll talk about this soft robot simulator in a moment. Nick took this class and went on to do a PhD. This was his PhD work, which was literally to evolve bodies and brains of soft robots in simulation to navigate through narrow apertures. If you've taken the evolutionary computation course here with Professor Cheney, it's the same Cheney. Okay. So how do we go about doing this? So we want to create robots that can get into places that are hard for rigid robots to get into. What should the bodies and brains of those soft robots look like? What a surprise. We're going to use an evolutionary algorithm to evolve bodies and brains of soft robots. But that means, unless we want to build thousands of physical soft robots, we need to evolve soft robots in simulation first, which means we need a soft-bodied simulator. If you think PyBullet was a headache to wrestle with, wait till you get a load of this simulator. Okay, here we go. It's called VoxCAD. It's a nod to VoxCAD or Voxcraft. It's a nod to that very famous video game, Minecraft. In VoxCAD or Voxcraft, everything is a cube or a voxel, a 3D pixel. We're going to build up the geometry of these soft robots using a whole bunch of voxels, which you've already seen over here. So let's start by imagining a very simple robot that's made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the 7th voxel inside that you can't see. This is how we render or draw the soft robot. Here's an animation of a relatively simple, it's not even a robot, it's just a flexible beam that's been built in this soft material simulator. You can tell just from the graphics that one end of this beam has been glued to a wall. There is a force that's acting on all the voxels that results in this behavior. What is that force? Gravity, right? Not that different from PyBullet. So we've got a whole bunch of objects, again, like in PyBullet, and at every time step in the soft-bodied simulator, every single object sums all of the forces that are acting on those objects, and then those objects move or accelerate as some function of the force acting on that object and that object's mass. Like in PyBullet, in the soft-bodied simulator, in VoxCAD or Voxcraft, this is ultimately the equation that's at work.
We want to know A, so if we divide both sides of this equation by m, we get A equals force divided by mass. So we want to know how each of these voxels is going to accelerate or change its position at the next time step. We know the force acting on the object, 9.8 meters per second squared downward, and we know the mass of that object, which gives us the acceleration of every one of these objects. And if this beam was not glued to the wall, it would just fall, as it would in pi bullet. It's glued to the wall, which you can think of as contacts. We talked about contact detection and resolution in the lecture on physics engines. That glue is applying a counteracting force to just these voxels here, which alters the acceleration of these voxels. In essence, the glue cancels out the downward force, which means for these voxels at every time step, the net force acting on them is 0, which means their acceleration is 0, which means at the next time step, these voxels don't move. These voxels are attached to these voxels, which in turn alter how these voxels move. So these voxels are not just being acted on by the downward force of gravity. These voxels are applying a force to these voxels. How does that work? Okay, let's go one level down in VoxCAD. This is how we draw things, but I want you to mentally shrink all 7 of these voxels. And as we do, we will see that in the physics engine itself, each one of these voxels is attached to its neighbor with a semi-rigid beam, represented by the gray beams here. These beams have each beam has 2 vectors associated with it, k and k sub, I always forget which one this is, phi? We'll go with phi, I never remember. Okay, k and k phi. K is always shorthand for stiffness. You remember when we discussed about springs? Springs have a stiffness and a dampening factor associated with them. We're not going to talk about the dampening here, just stiffness. K has 3 elements in it. K is a vector, and it represents how much the beam resists bending in this direction, how much the beam resists bending in this direction, and how much the beam resists bending in this direction, those 3 numbers. The bigger those numbers are, the greater those 3 stiffnesses. We could alter those numbers so we would have a beam that's kind of bendy in the horizontal direction. It's like a rubber tube, and on the vertical axis, it's like a steel beam. It resists twisting at all. The next one, k sub phi, also has 3 numbers associated with it, and it indicates how much the beam resists yawing, pitching, and rolling. So there are a total of 6 different forces that can act on the 2 ends of the beam. If we think about the beam now as being connected at 2 ends, there can be forces that do this, push in the x direction, push in the y direction, and the z direction. And then 2 of them that twist the beam in the 3 different directions. They're trying to induce yaw, pitch, and roll in the beam. So we've got 6 numbers associated with each beam that connects pairs of voxels together. So far, so good? Okay, if we were to take this particular collection of voxels, and you got to imagine pairwise connections between neighboring voxels now, and we were to paint very high numbers across all the k and the k phi's for every beam inside here, and then we simulated this one big beam, how would it behave? Each of these little beams inside has 6 very high magnitude numbers associated with them. Each pair of neighboring voxels is attached with very stiff connecting beams. How would this overall construction behave?
It would just kind of sit still, right?
Just stay still, right? It's a steel beam. If we went back and took exactly the same collection of voxels and beams and painted 6 numbers very close to 0 onto all of these beams and then simulated that construction, it would be basically like this, right? Very soft. If we reduce those numbers yet closer to 0, it would collapse. Yeah, it's like a half-melted candle, just wow. Okay. So by painting different physical features across this construction and placing these voxels in different positions, we can create different geometries, and we can create different combinations of rigid and soft materials. Okay. Okay, if you want to play around with this Voxcraft, my lab made its own version of it. There's the URL. You can go and play with it. As I mentioned, one version of this software is called VoxCAD because it has a graphical user interface on the front, which looks and acts more or less like a computer-aided design or CAD program. You'll notice that the user in this case is going to manually construct the 3D geometry of a robot here. They're going to start by building the lower level. They're going to do this in layers. They're going to put down the first base layer of the robot. You'll notice they're painting red squares, which are flexible. So they're picking from a palette. Whenever you place pairs of red voxels next to one another, they get connected together by a flexible beam. They've now moved the painting area up one level. They're painting blue voxels on top of the underlying red voxels, and the blue voxels are stiff voxels. Pairs of blue voxels that are attached together with little tiny steel beams. And off you go. So they're building the 3D geometry and the material properties at once. They're building it like a sandwich. Now they're putting a little bit of flexible material on top. I will speed this video up a little bit. Okay, and when they're done, they're going to run the physics. They're going to run the physics engine eventually. Okay. Doesn't really do much. But it is moving. It is actuated. So we haven't talked about the actuation. I'm going to turn the lights back on. We haven't talked about the actuation yet inside this robot. So it turns out that you can use VoxCAD to simulate inanimate objects like rubber and steel and clay. You can turn it into a robot simulator by taking all of the steel beams, or each of the beams, cutting them in half and putting an actual spring in the middle and attaching a motor to the spring, which reduces the resting length of that spring or extends that spring. You can also think about it like a piston, if you like. So we're going to actuate these materials. We're going to turn these materials into robots by increasing the length or decreasing the length of these beams, which are now springs or pistons. Everybody see that? Okay, so if we cut one of these beams in half and turn it into a piston and we pull the red voxels together, they will easily move towards each other and move away from one another. But if those two red voxels are attached to two blue voxels, which are resisting being pushed and pulled by their neighbors, it's not going to be as easy, and you might get some bending. The soft actuated material may pull inward and bend the rigid stuff slowly around it. So we can get some eventually interesting behavior by combining soft and stiff materials. So far, so good? Okay, I think this is probably a good place to end for today. You have a quiz due tonight. You're working on A/B testing for your final project. We'll see you on Tuesday when we'll talk about the written report and the oral presentation. Until then.